We've had now three generals assassinated in Moscow in the past year. Now, yes, I mean that's serious, and probably it will make people think twice about accepting that new promotion to a particular position. But on the other hand, there's no real suggestion that this is a sufficiently dense number of killings to really begin to sort of shift the needle of the sort of, shall I say, the mindset of Putin or his military high command. If the Ukrainians are able to ramp this up, then things may well change.
First of all, for a conflict Donald Trump thought he could resolve in a day, the Ukraine war has ground on for another year now. And the latest set of talks between Russia, the US and Ukraine seem to be no closer to a breakthrough. Nearly 4 years on from the Russian invasion, the war is increasingly spreading away from the front lines. Russia is blaming Ukraine for planting a car bomb in Moscow which killed a Russian general, while President Putin is being blamed by the West for waging a shadow war, with the new head of MI6 warning Russia is using tactics that are just below the threshold of war. Let's speak now to Mark Galeotti, leading expert on Russian crime and security, head of Mayak Intelligence, as well as a Sunday Times columnist. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Always a pleasure.
Before we move on to some of those, you heard what Donald Trump said about Greenland. He said that, Russia and China chips there all the time, and it's key now to US national security that they essentially annex Greenland. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, it continues to be this rather sort of bizarre obsession of his. And from the Russians' point of view, when he first said this way back after his inauguration, seemed a long, long time ago, actually, the Russians were quite concerned because they do have security interests in the area and they're increasingly expanding their footprint in the Arctic. Increasingly, though, they seem to have warmed to this idea, not because they think it's going to happen, but because it's a wonderful distraction. Putin himself said earlier in the year that, well, the Americans have got certain historical claims, because essentially the more America behaves like a frankly erratic banana republic, the more it is willing to break international law, then in some ways the more top cover it gives the Russians for what they're doing in Ukraine internationally.
Only at the moment there's a reality of, brutal Russian attempted invasion, and, Donald Trump is rattling sabers, perhaps talking about commissioning a whole new armada of Trump-class vessels, but he's not actually attacked Greenland, and he still presumably hopes to take it, with a checkbook rather than with force.
Yes, I mean, look, there seems to be no real chance that this is going to happen, even though he's appointed, a new representative, Mr. Landry, precisely to be his sort of point man on trying to sort of take this territory. I think it's more that if one looks at the fact that this is also a struggle, a political struggle, which is being fought in the rest of the world, especially in the global south, in which the West presents itself as not just simply defending Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens, but also defending the international law-based system. And Russia essentially is portraying the West as sanctimonious hypocrites who only use the law when it's in their interests. And look, much of this is just simply empty propaganda. But on the other hand, everything like this that we see actually ends up being used by the Russians in the global south to say, look, just remember what the West says, it's all a lie.
And thinking the two men together, very struck in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump used the word, respect. He wants respect, and he wants respect for America. Strangely enough, that's what Vladimir Putin made a big thing of yesterday, that if only the West would respect Russia, there would be no more war after Ukraine.
Yes, and both men really mean respect in the same way, which is, in other words, give me what I want. I mean, of course, you see, the difference is, when it comes down to it, for Trump, everything is personal. When he talks about respect, he means respect for him. Whereas for Putin, who has a slightly less fragile ego, it's actually about the respect for Russia. And when Putin talks about respect for Russia, again, he means accepting that it is a great power and therefore has certain sort of special powers and rights within the world. But yes, the two men do share a striking amount of their own sort of view of the world, which is one of the reasons why they can and do talk to each other so much.
We covered it yesterday, the killing of a senior Russian general on the streets of Moscow yesterday. How does that impact the psychology and the calculations of someone like Putin?
I mean, in and of itself, probably not much. I mean, General Sarvarov, he was essentially a sort of a well-respected kind of technical expert. He wasn't one of the fighting generals. He certainly wasn't the sort of person who was, in line for one of the most senior military positions. It's certainly an embarrassment for the security apparatus. The key thing is really the density of these attacks. We've had now 3 generals assassinated in Moscow in the past year. Now, yes, I mean that's serious, and probably it will make people think twice about accepting that new promotion to a particular position. But on the other hand, there's no real suggestion that this is a sufficiently dense number of killings to really begin to sort of shift the needle of the sort of, shall I say, the mindset of Putin or his military high command. If the Ukrainians are able to ramp this up, then things may well change. But at present, I think for Putin, who after all is safe behind a very, very extensive security system, it's in some ways just simply the price of fighting a war, that the front line now extends all across the country. And he uses it in his propaganda to tell Russians why, the Ukrainians need to be beaten because they are the sort of devils who are doing this, even while his missiles are raining down on Ukrainian cities.
It was very striking that he actually spelt it out overnight as well, or yesterday, that the idea that he is bent on attacking any other European country, in his word, is nonsense. But you wrote a fascinating piece last weekend, I think, taking as your cue the words of the head of MI6, that Russia is operating now just below the threshold of war in the grey zone, as she called it, Blaise Metrelli. And you were talking about essentially a war of disruption. Spell that out for us.
Yes, I mean, I think we have to realise it's worth starting with the caveat just to reassure people just before Christmas that this does not necessarily mean it's a transitional phase into a full-scale war. It's precisely because the West is vastly more powerful than Russia on pretty much any index you care to mention. And yet, as far as Putin is concerned, he is fighting in Ukraine a proxy war with the West. It is, after all, the Europeans who are essentially bankrolling this war now on the Ukrainian side. And what we are seeing is a growing campaign to carry out a variety of attacks in the West, cyber attacks, subversion, sabotage missions and such like, which in and of themselves individually may look trivial. Burning down a shopping mall in Poland, causing a cyber attack on, say, NHS systems, which is potentially Russian state, potentially not, we can't be certain. But when you put together, it looks as if it's what the Russians are doing is what I'm calling the weaponization of inconvenience. They're beginning to build up a campaign which they hope will in some ways insert enough grit into the workings of our day-to-day lives. Anything from slowing down the internet to, again, causing disruptions in supply chains, so that after a certain point, Western publics, European publics get just fed up with the cost to their own day-to-day lives of continuing to support Ukraine. Because there is a sense in Moscow that in some ways we've internalized our support for Ukraine, that we just got used to it. And although obviously there's a lot of money being spent on it, and especially within the EU, when they actually have to pay these loans, which they decided to use to raise money for Ukraine, that will have an impact on tax, that will have an impact on public services. Well, the Russians really want to try and illustrate the costs to us of supporting Ukraine. As I said, not as a prelude to a shooting war with the West, but in many ways to get us to back away from our support of Ukraine.
Mark, thank you very much for talking us through all of that. Mark Galeotti. And interesting, we were talking about how these two characters for different reasons want this thing respect. And I was just thinking what David Webb, one of our listeners, has written in. Highgater thugs, bullies and gangsters from the everyday world are obsessed with respect. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's something that they demand of us and says a lot about their, status anxiety.
Maybe. I think what Mark was saying that was so stark is actually Donald Trump's comments when it comes, if we look back to Greenland, saying we must have it. acts in effect as a bit of a smokescreen for Vladimir Putin, because while Donald Trump speaks in this sort of expansionist way, when asked, he won't rule out taking Greenland by force, which, when you just take that as one initial statement, is completely extraordinary, having failed to buy Greenland. That sort of dampens down the impact, bizarrely, of what Putin is doing.
Yeah, we've surrendered as the West, I guess, the moral high ground there. And then it makes it harder and harder to criticise people who behave like cowboys when, we behave as cowboys ourselves.
And when arguably Donald Trump is probably the most powerful or most influential figure in the conversations we're having with, let's say, Putin, with Ukraine, what does a country like Denmark, Greenland, how do they respond and stave off Donald Trump's comments like that? Because he will not let it go. His first term, he tried to buy Greenland. That wasn't possible. And maybe he's using it as a distraction tactic to sort of create news elsewhere to distract from what's happening at home. But it does leave them in an extraordinary position where they have to say to one of their allies, no, you can't just annex this piece of land and take control of it. And the population of Greenland certainly don't want that to happen every time they're polled. There's been a bit of developing news actually in the last couple of minutes just related to this story. In the last few minutes, the Ukrainian Prime Minister has said Russia attacked Ukraine with dozens of missiles and hundreds of drones overnight. She said the heaviest damage was on energy infrastructure in Ukraine's western regions. We'll have more for this on you a little bit later.